Hi, everyone. In this video lecture, we're going to be talking about this process called cellular respiration. And cellular respiration has to do with the production of energy for our cells. So I first wanted to start off by just talking about why living things need energy and why our cells need energy. And the short answer is that basically staying alive requires energy. So there are a ton of functions that our cells need to do or that organisms need to do that all are going to take energy. So there are obvious things like running around or any sort of movement that takes energy. But there are also things that are harder to see. So membrane transport, moving molecules against their concentration gradient. Also, things like staying warm if you're a warm blooded animal. So, if you're not using the sun to keep you warm, then you need to generate heat internally, and that process takes energy. And then finally, any sort of building of molecules, so making larger molecules from smaller pieces. So that's going to happen as animals are growing and getting larger. It would also happen if there's some sort of damage that needs to be repaired. So any sort of, if you think about the process of, for example, mitosis, that takes a lot of energy to create a new cell. So energy is used to carry out all kinds of functions that are required for life, and so we need a way to make that energy. And that process whereby we're making energy is called cellular respiration. So, this next slide is just going to be an overview of the sort of big picture. So, cellular respiration is where we're transforming the chemical energy in food. Specifically, we're taking the sugars from food and transforming it into chemical energy that the cells can actually use. And that chemical energy is going to be in the form of ATP. So ATP is a molecule and it's the energy currency of the cells. We'll talk more about it in a minute. But essentially, we're taking sugars from food, transforming them into chemical energy for cells, ATP. This process is taking place inside of cells. It is a long series of really complicated biochemical steps that we're going to be sort of just taking a big picture view of, and it's performed by all living organisms. I just said every organism needs energy in order to stay alive. So every single organism is going to be doing cellular respiration. That includes heterotrophs that get their energy and their sugars by eating other things, but it also includes autotrophs. So even plants that are making their own sugars, they still have to do cellular respiration in order to utilize that sugar to get ATP. So every single living organism does cellular respiration. Okay, so this slide is just a little overview of what ATP is and how it's used in the cell. So ATP stands for adenosine triphosphate. You don't really need to know why that is, but you might notice here that there are three little golden colored circles on this ATP molecule, and that comes from the tri or three phosphate. So these are three phosphates, adenosine triphosphate. Um, so ATP is the energy currency of living things. And the reason that cells use it is because it has the appropriate amount of energy for our cells to do what they need to do. So you might be wondering, like, if we're taking the chemical energy found in glucose, why can't we just use that in our cells? Why can't cells just use glucose to fuel the things that they need to do? And it's sort of like if you were to go to a vending machine and you only had $100 bills. Glucose just has too much energy. It's not the right amount for what the cell needs to be doing. So ATP is like the $1 bill. It's going to be the right amount of energy for cells to do what they need to do. ATP is a stored form of chemical energy, so you can think of it as sort of like a charged battery. So ATP can float around in the cell, and we can use that battery to power other things, to make other things happen. So ATP is able to release energy when and where it's needed. And when ATP releases that energy, it goes into this dead battery form called ADP. So that you'll notice there's only two phosphates. So this is adenosine diphosphate, two phosphates, and this third phosphate gets separated. So we're just chopping off this last phosphate from the ATP molecule. When that last phosphate molecule becomes separated, that process is going to release energy, and we are going to be using that energy for something else, maybe moving molecules against their concentration gradient. But now we have this dead battery that can't do anything anymore. But luckily, ATP is recyclable, so we can put energy back into it, sort of recharge the battery, and reattach that phosphate molecule. And then we've got a recharge battery, and it can repeat the whole process where now this ATP can go and power some other process in the cell. So ATP is really important for everything that your cell needs to do, basically. And again, you can just think of it as this battery that's floating around in the cell and can power other things. And we can recharge it once we've used the energy within it. Okay, so this is a big picture sort of schematic of both photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So, just as a reminder, since it's been a while since we've talked about what photosynthesis is, with photosynthesis, we're taking small inorganic molecules, specifically carbon dioxide and water. We're using the energy from sunlight, and then photosynthetic organisms are using those things to turn the carbon dioxide and water into these larger molecules called glucose. So, carbon dioxide plus water plus the energy from the sun gives you glucose, which is C6H12O6, and has oxygen as a byproduct. And then you can think in a lot of ways, cellular respiration is sort of the exact opposite. So, with cellular respiration, we're taking glucose and it's usually in the presence of oxygen, and we're breaking the glucose down, and as a result we're getting the byproducts of water and carbon dioxide, and we're getting energy that we can use to recharge the battery for ATP. So we're getting energy in the form of ATP and water and carbon dioxide by breaking down glucose. So it's sort of like the exact opposite of one another in terms of the input and the output for cellular respiration and photosynthesis. Okay, so these next few slides, we're going to be talking about two different kinds of cellular respiration. And I'm going to start with this process called aerobic cellular respiration. And this aerobic refers to the fact that aerobic cellular respiration is happening in the presence of oxygen. So this formula is saying we're taking sugar, specifically glucose, and oxygen, and after a series of a bunch of steps, we're getting a byproduct of carbon dioxide and water and ATP, a lot of ATP, like about 38 molecules of it. So you'll notice that we're breaking the sugar back down to what it started as. Plants originally took carbon dioxide and water and used it to make the sugar, and now we're completely breaking down the sugar back into its sort of component parts of carbon dioxide and water again. So we're using that oxygen to completely break down the glucose back into what it started as. And as a result, we get lots of energy, lots of ATP. And there are three main steps for aerobic cellular respiration. The first one happens in the cytoplasm, and it's called glycolysis. And essentially, for glycolysis, it's the most sort of ancient part of aerobic cellular respiration. We're just chopping that glucose in half. So, chopping glucose into two molecules. It happens, as I said, in the cytoplasm. We don't need any oxygen for this step. So it evolved before oxygen was around. So we don't get very much ATP from it, just two molecules. And we're just doing one very simple step, chopping glucose in half. So glycolysis happens in the cytoplasm, no oxygen. And then the second and third step, we're moving the results of glycolysis, pyruvate or pyruvic acid. We're taking those pieces that we chopped glucose into and moving them into the mitochondria. And this is where we're going to start to require oxygen. Essentially, anything that happens in the mitochondria is going to need oxygen in order to proceed. So, the two steps here, the second and third step, are the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain. And so, as a result, in the mitochondria, we're releasing those byproducts of carbon dioxide and water. And it's also where we're generating the vast majority of the ATP that comes from aerobic cellular respiration. So the mitochondria is where the oxygen requiring steps happen. It's also where essentially virtually all of the ATP from aerobic cellular respiration is being produced. So Krebs cycle and electron transport chain, second and third steps in the mitochondria, but we do need oxygen in order for those to proceed. So it is the case that there's not always oxygen around in order to completely break down that glucose. So I said we're using oxygen to completely break down the glucose, but what if we don't have oxygen around? Some organisms live in places without oxygen. So what happens then? There's another way for cellular respiration to occur, and it's called anaerobic respiration. Another word for it is fermentation. And essentially, if aerobic respiration meant respiration with oxygen, anaerobic respiration means respiration without oxygen. So the downside is that it's way less efficient. You're only getting about 2 molecules of ATP instead of the 38 molecules that we talked about with aerobic cellular respiration. And you might notice we get 2 ATP from this first step here, glycolysis, that doesn't require oxygen. So essentially, anaerobic respiration is just this first step, this glycolysis step, plus a couple little extra touches here and there. So cellular respiration without oxygen, it's less efficient, only making 2 molecules of ATP. There are two common pathways for this to occur. So we're still starting with the same starting molecules, still starting with glucose. And then in animals, including us as humans and some bacteria, we're turning that glucose into lactic acid and a little bit of ATP. And then in other bacteria and yeast, we're taking that glucose and turning it into ethanol, carbon dioxide, and a little bit of ATP. Um, these processes are used to create a lot of foods and beverages that humans enjoy. So things like bread, cheese, beer and wine, yogurt, pickled things, soy sauce, all produced by some sort of fermentation, either by bacteria or yeast. So again, this is way less efficient, but it does allow these organisms to get energy in places where there aren't oxygen. So, for example, sometimes when you're exercising really, really intensely, so like sprinting or lifting really heavy weights, your muscles don't get enough oxygen in order to do aerobic cellular respiration. So they resort to doing this fermentation instead, and you'll generate lactic acid and a little bit of ATP to sort of supplement the aerobic cellular respiration when there's not enough oxygen to fully rely on aerobic respiration. Okay, so just as a last slide, just an overview of aerobic versus anaerobic respiration. In both cases, we're taking glucose as our starting molecule. And again, our goal is to produce ATP. So the first step is glycolysis for both. And in glycolysis, we're just chopping that glucose molecule in half, chopping it into two pieces, and we get a little bit of ATP. And if there's no oxygen around, then that's kind of it. So we're either going to turn that pyruvic acid into lactic acid or ethanol, and we're kind of just done. And we'll just repeat this little cycle, just getting a little bit of ATP every time. But if there is oxygen around, then we can more fully break down these pieces that we got from glucose, and we can go into the mitochondria, do the Krebs cycle, do this is just another word for the electron transport chain, but do those steps that are happening in the mitochondria. Get a lot more ATP because we're going to be fully breaking down that glucose into carbon dioxide and water. And that's aerobic respiration when we're able to do that. Okay, so that's the end of our lecture on cellular respiration, and I will see you all soon.